Mist drifts low across the fjord, curling in slow ribbons that catch the first gray light of dawn. The water is still, the kind of stillness that feels ancient, older than speech, older than kingdoms. Somewhere beyond the veil of fog, a gull cries once, and the sound fades into silence. It is said that when the sea is quiet like this, it is listening. And if one listens closely enough, the sea will speak back. Its voice is not made of words, but of memory, a language of echoes, lost names, and forgotten oaths carried beneath the waves. The story begins here, where the world feels suspended between sleep and waking. A lone boat drifts in the distance, its wooden hull creaking softly as if exhaling. Inside sits an old man, wrapped in a wool cloak heavy with salt. His eyes are closed, his lips moving faintly, whispering to something that no longer answers. Some say he is a fisherman, others say he is a keeper of the dead. Whatever he is, he knows this fjord as others know prayer. He waits for the tide to turn, for the whisper that always comes before dawn, the whisper of the king's ghost. Long ago, before the kingdoms of the north bent beneath one crown, before the cross stood where the ravens once gathered, this coast was ruled by men who feared nothing but the silence of the sea. Their ships roamed far beyond the horizon, chasing conquest, glory, and death in equal measure. They believed that names were eternal, that to be remembered was to live forever. Yet there was one among them whose name was erased, not by time, but by intent. A warrior so revered that kings sought his loyalty, and so feared that even the gods seemed to turn their faces away. His tale, like his name, was swallowed by the waves, leaving only fragments. A song without verses, a ghost without a grave. The people who live near these waters tell stories still. They speak of strange lights that shimmer across the tide, of footsteps echoing on stone paths long abandoned, of voices calling out in the old tongue when no one is there. Children are told not to whisper his name, though none remember what it was. The elders say it is better that way, for names have power, and some powers are best left sleeping. Yet every few generations, when the fog thickens and the moon sits low, someone claims to have heard it, a single word carried on the wind, as soft as breath, as heavy as fate. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it too. The rhythm of the oars, the creak of timber, the murmur of waves against stone. The world of the past draws near, gentle as a tide returning home. The air smells of iron and pine, of cold rain and smoke from distant fires. The land feels alive, restless, haunted by stories buried beneath its soil. Somewhere deep below, beneath centuries of silt and silence, lies the truth, the rise and fall of a man who was both warrior and ghost, hero and curse. They say his story began with blood, as most Viking tales do, but it ended in something colder, erasure. Not death, but the deliberate unmaking of a name. The old man in the boat knows this, though he would never say so aloud. Instead, he listens. The sea murmurs against the rocks, forming sounds that almost shape into syllables. He lowers his head and whispers back, a quiet exchange between the living and the lost. In that moment, the veil between worlds feels thin, as if history itself might stir and breathe again. The light grows stronger, brushing gold across the mist. In the distance, mountains rise like sleeping gods, their peaks veiled in cloud. The old man finally opens his eyes. For a heartbeat, the reflection of another face flickers in the water beside him, pale, scarred eyes like frozen sky. Then it is gone, swallowed by the ripples. He exhales slowly, neither afraid nor surprised. He has seen that face before, many times in many mornings just like this. It always returns when the sea remembers. Soon the tide will turn, and the day will begin. Fishermen will set out, children will play along the rocky shore, and the whispers will fade once more into the depths. But for now, in this narrow space between night and light, the story waits, the story of the Viking who became a king's ghost, and whose name was stolen from history itself. The sea holds his memory still, patient and eternal, waiting for someone willing to listen. The fog drifts higher, swallowing the horizon. The old man's boat drifts with it, small against the vastness. A final whisper breaks through the hush, softer than the wind, almost human, a word that once meant courage or maybe sorrow. The old man bows his head, as though in reverence. Somewhere, far below, the past stirs. And as the first rays of sunlight pierce the mist, the fjord gleams like a mirror of gold and shadow, a reminder that even the forgotten are never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered. The world of the north once breathed in rhythm with the sea. Every dawn began with the pull of the tide, the hiss of surf against stone, and the cries of gulls circling above longships carved with the faces of dragons. It was a world ruled by the wind, where men learned early that survival was a fragile thing balanced between courage and cruelty. Villages clung to the edges of fjords, smoke rising from turf-roofed halls, their fires flickering like hearts against the cold. The people who lived here did not see themselves as conquerors, at least not at first. They were farmers, fishermen, dreamers bound to the land, until hunger and winter taught them that the sea offered more than fish. The sea offered promise. To sail meant to live twice, once as flesh and once as legend. From the narrow inlets of Norway and Denmark, men built sleek ships with shallow hulls and wide sails dyed crimson. They followed the stars and the flight of ravens, chasing whispers of new lands where silver flowed through rivers and kings slept on beds of gold. Some never returned. Those who did came home changed, eyes sharper, hearts heavier. They spoke of kingdoms across the water, of monks who wrote in strange letters, of cities with walls so high they hid the sky. And so began the fever that would define an age, the hunger for more. This was the Viking world, not a single nation, but a storm scattered across the north. Each chieftain ruled his own corner of rock and ice, bound by fragile oaths and fiercer pride. Bloodlines were sacred, betrayal was swift. Feasts filled the longhouses with laughter, but behind every toast lingered the shadow of revenge. In this world, even gods demanded courage as payment. Odin watched from above, trading eyes for wisdom. Thor guarded the storms. Freya ruled love and death alike. Yet as the years passed, new gods began to cross the sea, carried not by swords, but by the quiet words of priests. The cross rose where once the hammer had stood, and the old ways trembled like ice beneath a thaw. Still, the heart of the people beat the same. Warriors trained with axe and shield from boyhood, learning to read the moods of the sea better than the moods of men. They tattooed runes across their skin, each one a prayer or a warning. To die in battle was not tragedy, it was honor. A man's worth was measured not in his years but in the songs sung after his death. Around the hearth, skalds told tales of heroes who had conquered distant lands, of sailors who had seen the edge of the world and returned to tell of it. Their voices wove history and myth together until both became one. It was an age of contradiction, beauty carved from brutality, peace built on plunder. The same hands that offered bread could wield a blade without hesitation. Mothers raised children who would one day die before 30, yet their laughter filled the long nights with warmth. The sagas tell of banquets lit by hundreds of candles, the air thick with the scent of mead and pine smoke, where kings and killers sat side by side. It was in such halls that destinies were forged and broken beneath the watchful eyes of gods and men alike. Across the sea, the world trembled at the sound of their sails. To the east, the rivers of Rus carried traders and raiders deep into the heart of empires. To the west, the coasts of Francia and the British Isles burned beneath sudden dawn attacks. Yet the Vikings were more than destroyers. They were builders, poets, explorers. They founded cities where no cities had stood, mapped seas no man had dared to cross, and left words etched into stone that still whisper their names. Even in their violence, there was vision, a restless longing to carve meaning from the chaos of existence. But the age of kings was rising, and with it came a new kind of order. In the south, crowns grew heavier, and thrones demanded obedience instead of oaths. The world was shifting, its edges hardening. The Vikings, who had once moved freely between realms, began to find the walls closing in. Kingdoms learned their tactics, built stronger fortresses, raised armies trained not in courage but in discipline. Slowly, the Northmen found themselves no longer the storm but the wind after the storm, still fierce, but fading. Yet in that fading, something new began to take shape. Some warriors chose to serve foreign kings instead of fighting them. Some settled in the lands they once raided, building homes from the ashes of conquest. Others vanished entirely, their names swallowed by history's tide. This was the twilight of an age, not its end, but its transformation. The world of gods and ghosts gave way to the world of kings and chronicles. Yet the spirit of the Old North lingered like smoke in the rafters of memory. It lived in the songs, in the runes carved deep into wood, in the bones of ships buried beneath the sand. It lived in stories like the one you are about to hear, stories of men who stood at the edge of two worlds, neither wholly pagan nor wholly Christian, caught between belief and doubt, flesh and legend. Among them was one man whose name, once spoken with reverence, would one day be struck from every record. A warrior born in this turning of ages, shaped by both the fury of the old gods and the order of the new kings. His life would begin in the fire of battle and end in the cold silence of forgetting. Yet his presence would haunt both realms, the living and the dead, like a shadow that refuses to fade. His name was once sung in the mead halls and carved in stone, but now it drifts like ash across the centuries, waiting for someone to remember. The sea, still whispering against the fjords, remembers. It remembers the rise of ships, the cries of warriors, the oaths sworn and broken. It remembers the first time this man looked upon the world and knew it would one day forget him. And it remembers how, even as kingdoms rose and gods fell silent, the echo of his story endured, quiet, patient, and immortal beneath the waves. He was born beneath a blood-red sky, the kind of dawn that made the old women cross themselves and whisper to the gods. The year was harsh, the winter long, and when he drew his first breath, the wind howled across the fjord as if to mark his arrival. His mother said she felt the earth tremble beneath her during labor, a sign that his life would be neither quiet nor ordinary. His father, a fisherman and warrior, looked into the child's eyes and saw something unyielding, pale gray, like steel under ice. They named him a word that meant strength in the old tongue, a name that once carried honor through generations. That name, like his life, would one day vanish from every record. But in that moment, it was spoken with pride, carried on the smoke rising from the hearth. The village where he grew was small, pressed between mountain and sea. It was a place where every sound echoed, the creak of boats, the hiss of fire, the laughter of men who had learned to drink away fear. The air smelled of salt, pine, and iron. He grew up with the rhythm of the waves, learning to row before he could run, to read the moods of the sea by the shape of the clouds. When the storms came, he would watch the older men fight against the wind, their bodies bent but unbroken. He learned early that the sea respected only those who respected its power, and punished those who didn't. His childhood was carved from the same raw material as the land. Hard, unrelenting, beautiful. His mother sang songs of the gods, her voice soft like falling snow, while his father told tales of raids and kings, men who crossed oceans for silver and glory. Around the hearth, he listened, his young mind catching every word like embers. He dreamed of ships, of distant lands where the sun burned longer, of swords that gleamed like lightning. Yet there was a quietness in him too, a reflective stillness that made the elders say he carried an old soul. He would often wander into the woods at dusk, following the glow of the fireflies, listening to the low hum of the world. The rituals of youth were not gentle. At 12, he was tested by the cold, left alone on the mountain for a night with nothing but a knife and a fur cloak. He returned at dawn, shivering, but alive, a small cut across his hand where he had sworn his first oath to the gods. At 13, he joined the village men in their first raid across the neighboring coast, rowing until his arms burned, his heart pounding with the rhythm of the drums. The sight of battle both thrilled and terrified him. The clash of shields, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the raw chaos of men fighting for breath. He killed once, and when it was over he wept quietly behind the ship's stern. The older warriors said it was good. It meant he still had a heart. As the years passed, the boy became a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of firelight and a voice that carried through the wind. His skill with the axe grew legendary within his clan. He fought not with frenzy but with precision, each strike deliberate, each motion balanced between grace and death. Yet what set him apart was not strength, but restraint. He fought only when he must, and when the fighting was done, he buried the dead with his own hands. That earned him respect and something rare, trust. In the long winters, when snow buried the world in silence, he would sit by the fire carving runes into driftwood. He carved not for worship, but remembrance, marking the names of those who had fallen, the friends who never returned from the sea. A name, he once said to his younger brother, is a kind of soul. When it is forgotten, the soul wanders. It was a strange thing for a young warrior to say, and the others laughed, but his brother remembered those words long after he was gone. The gods seemed to watch him closely. There were omens. A raven perched on his roof for 3 days, a sudden storm that broke when he raised his hand to the sky. The village seer said his fate was bound to kings and ghosts, though she would not say which would claim him first. He laughed then, young and proud, believing himself master of his own destiny. But somewhere deep within, he felt the weight of something vast and unseen, as if his life were part of a story already written in the stars. He saw his first true sea voyage at 17. The ship was sleek, its hull painted with black tar and symbols of protection. The air before departure was electric, the shouts of sailors, the smell of pitch, the glitter of sunlight on blades. When the longship cut across the open water, he felt a freedom he had never known. The land receded into mist, and before him stretched the endless expanse of the unknown. The waves rose high, and he stood at the prow, face lifted to the wind, heart pounding like a drum. It was in that moment he understood why men left home to chase horizons, not for gold, but for the feeling of becoming something greater than themselves. By the time they returned months later, he was no longer a boy. His hands bore scars, his eyes carried distance. The others celebrated their spoils, chests of silver, rings torn from foreign priests, but he carried something invisible, a question that would never leave him. What makes a man worth remembering? Was it the songs sung about him, or the truth that lingered when those songs were forgotten? The village welcomed them with fire and feast. His father's pride was quiet, his mother's joy threaded with fear. She saw something different in him, not darkness, but destiny. In her sleep, she dreamed of a crown shattered into the sea, of her son standing before a king who cast no shadow. When she woke, she told no one. The north was full of prophecies, and most were better left unspoken. That winter, the sky stayed gray for weeks. Snow covered the fjord like a shroud. He spent long hours staring at the frozen water, imagining what lay beneath it, old ships, lost bones, forgotten gods. The stillness stirred something in him, a restlessness that would soon drive him far beyond his homeland. The boy who had once listened to stories by the fire now longed to become one. And though he did not know it, the sea was already whispering his name, carrying it toward a destiny that would make him immortal and erase him all the same. The spring he turned 19, the wind changed. It carried the smell of rain mixed with iron, the scent of war. Messengers came from the south, their ships heavy with rumor. A powerful chieftain was gathering men for a great campaign across the sea, where the kingdoms of the English were divided, ripe for conquest. The promise was silver, glory, and land, but for the young warrior, it was something more. It was the call of destiny, the kind of call no man of his blood could ignore. His father tried to dissuade him, speaking of storms, betrayal, and the hunger that lived in the hearts of kings. But the son had already decided. He sharpened his axe in silence, his reflection flickering in the steel. When he spoke, his voice was steady. If I stay, I'll grow roots. If I go, I'll grow wings. The night before his departure, the village held a feast. The air inside the longhouse was thick with smoke and laughter. The skalds sang old sagas of Odin's warriors and the road to Valhalla. The young man sat near the fire, quiet, his fingers tracing the rim of his drinking horn. His mother watched him with proud sorrow, knowing this might be the last time she saw him alive. When the flames burned low, she pressed a small carved amulet into his palm, a piece of driftwood etched with runes for protection. Even the gods forget, she whispered, but the sea remembers. He tied it around his neck and never took it off again. At dawn, the fleet gathered. Longships stretched across the harbor like a forest of masts, their sails painted with bold symbols of ravens and serpents. Warriors loaded supplies, sharpening blades, laughing to hide their fear. The young man stood at the prow of his ship, feeling the vibration of the oars through the deck. The world ahead shimmered with promise. As the first drumbeat echoed, the ships began to move, their hulls slicing through the cold water like knives. The coastline faded into mist, and with it, his past. The journey across the North Sea was both brutal and beautiful. The sky changed moods without warning, one moment calm, the next raging with thunder. The men rode through sleepless nights, their hands blistered and raw. Salt crusted their beards, and hunger gnawed at them like a restless spirit. Yet through it all, there was a strange peace. The sound of the oars, the crash of waves, the rhythmic chanting of rowers. It became a kind of prayer. He often stood awake long after the others slept, watching the stars shimmer across the dark water. Sometimes he thought he heard voices beneath the waves, like whispers calling his name. On the 12th night, a storm struck. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the sails. Lightning split the sky, illuminating faces pale with fear. One ship capsized, another drifted away into the darkness. The young warrior gripped the mast, shouting commands over the roar of wind. His voice carried strength that surprised even him. When dawn came, half the fleet was gone, swallowed by the sea. The survivors built a pyre upon the shore of a nameless island, sending their dead back to the gods. As the flames burned, he stood alone, eyes reflecting the firelight, feeling both sorrow and clarity. The storm had stripped him of fear. He was no longer a boy chasing glory, he was something harder, quieter, forged. Weeks later, the surviving ships reached the English coast. The land before them was green and soft, so different from the stone and ice of home. Villages dotted the hills like scattered pearls. The men disembarked with awe and hunger in their eyes. The chieftain, a towering man with hair like snow, gathered them on the shore. "Take nothing you cannot defend," he said. "But remember, to die with honor is better than to live with shame." The warriors roared their approval, but the young man listened in silence, studying the horizon. In that distant line of trees, he sensed something watching. The raids began swiftly. Churches were plundered, their bells silenced, towns burned beneath the banner of the raven. Silver flowed like water, but so did blood. For every victory, there was a shadow of unease. The young warrior fought with precision, moving through chaos as if guided by something unseen. His axe found its mark again and again, yet he felt no joy, only a quiet determination, as though each strike brought him closer to an unknown truth. The English defenders fought fiercely, praying to their God even as they fell. In their eyes he saw fear, but also faith. It stirred something in him, something that felt dangerously close to doubt. As weeks turned into months, the campaign shifted. The chieftain, hungry for more than silver, sought alliance with a local king, a ruler of fractured lands, desperate for strength. Negotiations took place beneath a white banner in a field of wildflowers. The young warrior stood guard behind his leader, his hand resting on the haft of his axe. Across from them stood the English king, dressed not in gold but in humility. His voice was calm, his eyes thoughtful, and when he spoke, it was not of conquest but of order, of building a realm where men could live without endless bloodshed. The warrior did not understand all his words, but he felt their weight. It was the first time he wondered if strength alone was enough to shape a world. That night, as fires flickered across the camp, he walked alone to the edge of the river. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and he could see his reflection, a face hardened by war, yet haunted by something unspoken. He remembered his mother's warning, her voice woven through the rush of wind. Even the gods forget, but the sea remembers. He knelt, dipped his hand into the current, and felt it pull gently, as if urging him onward toward a destiny he could not yet see. When he returned to the camp, he found the chieftain waiting. "You fight like the gods are watching," the older man said. "But you look like you wish they'd look away." The young warrior didn't answer. The chieftain studied him, then nodded. "There's more in you than war. That will make you dangerous one day." He walked away, leaving the warrior alone with the fire's glow and the sound of distant thunder rolling across the hills. Before dawn, A messenger arrived from the English king, bearing a seal marked in red wax. The chieftain called his most trusted men, and among them, the young warrior. They were to travel inland under truce, to stand before the king himself. As they set out, the rising sun painted the fields in gold, and the air smelled of spring and iron. The warrior rode in silence, the amulet at his neck warm against his skin. He did not yet know that this meeting would change his fate, that the path of blood and oath he had chosen would lead not to glory, but to the ghost of a king, and a name the world would one day try to erase. The journey inland was long and silent. The land unfolded before them in soft shades of green and gold, a sharp contrast to the granite and ice of home. Smoke curled from distant cottages, and the air was rich with the scent of earth and spring. The warriors moved cautiously, their axes wrapped in leather, their armor dulled so as not to glint beneath the sun. Each hill they crossed revealed another village, another church bell tolling faintly in the wind. To the young Viking, this new world felt strange, quieter, gentler, but watchful. He sensed that beneath its calm surface, something ancient and restless stirred. They reached the king's hall near dusk. It stood upon a low rise, surrounded by fields of heather and a wooden palisade that glowed amber in the setting light. The banners bore the cross, a symbol he still found unsettling. To him, it seemed both fragile and defiant, a mark of faith that dared the world to test it. The English guards eyed the Norsemen warily but did not raise their spears. A truce was a fragile thing, but for now it held. Inside the hall, the air was heavy with incense and the murmur of prayer. The warrior followed his chieftain through a corridor of carved beams until they reached the king. The English king was not what he expected. He was neither tall nor armored, but there was a strength about him that made even the fiercest warriors lower their gaze. His hair was graying, his eyes steady and unafraid. He greeted the Norsemen not as enemies but as equals, his voice calm yet firm, each word measured like a blade. He spoke of peace, of uniting his divided land under one rule, of building something that could endure beyond a single lifetime. The chieftain listened with the cautious skepticism of a man who had survived too many oaths. But the young warrior found himself drawn to the king's conviction. It was not weakness he saw in the man's restraint, it was power of another kind, quieter but no less commanding. After the council, the king invited the chieftain's party to dine. The hall filled with the smell of roasted meat and honeyed wine, yet the atmosphere was tense, as if everyone sensed that history was being written in silence between words. The warrior sat near the edge of the gathering, his eyes wandering over the carved crosses, the flickering candles, the painted saints gazing down from the walls. He felt as though the room itself was watching him. When the king raised his cup in toast, their eyes met for the first time. A brief moment, but one that burned itself into memory. In that gaze, he felt seen in a way he never had before. The king's look was not one of judgment or fear, but recognition, as if he had glimpsed the ghost of something familiar. That night, as the hall quieted and the fires burned low, the warrior found himself unable to sleep. He walked to the courtyard, where the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. The moonlight spilled across the flagstones, pale and pure. A monk passed by, murmuring a prayer, and the sound stirred something within him. He did not understand the words, but the cadence felt sacred, not unlike the old chants sung by his own people. For the first time, he wondered if the gods of this land listened to prayers differently, or if perhaps all gods heard the same voice and only men argued over their names. The next morning, the king spoke privately with him. It was unusual, a ruler addressing a foreign warrior without his leader present. Yet there was no arrogance in his tone, only curiosity. "You fight with discipline," the king said, "not rage. That is rare among your kind." The warrior bowed his head slightly, unsure how to answer. "Rage burns fast," he finally said. "Discipline endures." The king smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for that answer. "Endurance builds kingdoms," he said. "But it also builds ghosts. Remember that." From that day, the bond between them began to form, not of friendship, but of understanding. The king saw in the Viking a reflection of something he had lost, the purity of purpose that once drove him before crowns and politics clouded his vision. And the warrior saw in the king what his own people lacked, a belief that power could be tempered with wisdom, that honor was not found only in the spilling of blood. Still, he felt the pull of the old world within him, the voice of the sea, the whisper of his ancestors urging him not to trust the words of foreign men. Weeks passed, and the truce between the two sides deepened into an uneasy alliance. The king's lands were under constant threat from rival lords, and he offered the Norsemen a place among his defenders. Some accepted eagerly, dreaming of silver and status. Others refused, loyal only to the old gods and the call of the sea. The young warrior hesitated, torn between oath and instinct. One night, standing alone on the ramparts, he looked out across the misty fields and felt the world shifting beneath him. He knew the path he chose now would shape not only his life but his name, a name that would one day be spoken in fear, then erased altogether. He agreed to serve the king, swearing his loyalty not as a subject but as a brother in arms. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by a handful of men. The king placed his hand upon the warrior's shoulder and said, "Let your strength guard my reign, and my word guard your soul." It was a strange vow, binding pagan and Christian in a pact that defied both faiths. When it was done, the warrior felt something stir within him, not pride, but weight. The sea, watching from afar, seemed to hold its breath. Under the king's command, he learned a new kind of battle. It was not the chaos of raiding but the strategy of nations, patience, diplomacy, restraint. He rode through villages where the people looked upon him with suspicion, whispering prayers as he passed. He began to see the cost of conquest not in numbers, but in faces, children staring from doorways, widows clutching crosses, fields burned in vengeance. He started to understand what the king had meant, that endurance builds ghosts. Every victory left another shadow behind. And yet, the bond between them deepened. The king trusted him in ways that unsettled his own nobles. Together, they walked the borders of the realm, speaking softly of order and chaos, of faith and fate. Sometimes the king would pause, gazing toward the northern horizon, and say, "You come from a land where men still listen to the wind. Tell me, does it ever speak truth?" The warrior would smile faintly and answer, "Only to those who know how to listen." In time, rumors began to spread. Whispers in the corridors, cautious glances from courtiers, the strange foreigner who had become the king's shadow. Some said he was the monarch's weapon, others said he was his curse. The churchmen murmured that no good could come from binding light and darkness together. But the king ignored them, and the warrior, though uneasy, stayed by his side. Deep down, both men knew their bond defied the order of things. And deep down, both sensed that fate was watching, patient, cold, and waiting for its due. War came quietly at first, like a whisper in the dark. It began with a messenger arriving at dawn, his horse foam-flecked and trembling, eyes wide with terror. He spoke of rebellion, a coalition of lords from the east who had risen against the crown. The king listened without anger or surprise, only a weary understanding, as though he had long expected this betrayal. The Norse warriors stood nearby, silent, watching the weight settle upon the king's shoulders. There was no thunderous cry for vengeance, no rousing speech. Only a slow nod, and the calm instruction to prepare the men. The storm had returned, and this time it would test both their bond and their beliefs. As the army gathered, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Villages emptied, fields lay abandoned, and crows followed the marching columns as if drawn to the scent of destiny. The warrior rode beside the king's banner, his armor marked by runes from his homeland, old symbols of protection that made the English priests uneasy. The king noticed but said nothing. He had learned that faith, no matter its shape, could become a soldier's armor. And in the Viking's silent devotion, he saw no threat, only fire. Together they advanced through forests thick with mist, where every rustle might have been an arrow, and every shadow a ghost of betrayal. On the third day, the first skirmish broke. The rebels struck from the trees, arrows slicing through fog. The Viking's instincts came alive. The chaos, the scent of blood, the old rhythm of war. But he fought differently now, deliberate, measured, almost reverent. The king fought too, though age had slowed his sword. Yet every strike he made carried purpose, like a man defending not his life but his soul. When the smoke cleared, the field was littered with bodies, both friend and foe. The air was thick with the silence that follows killing. Not triumph, not grief, just the hollow stillness of survival. As they moved deeper into enemy territory, the warrior began to notice something strange. The king grew quieter, his eyes often distant, as if he were seeing things others could not. At night, he would sit apart from the campfires, whispering to the darkness. Once, the Viking approached and heard fragments of words, prayers, but twisted with doubt. "If I fall," the king murmured, "will the crown still hold the realm together? Or will it shatter like glass?" The Viking said nothing, only stood guard nearby. In his own heart, he felt a shadow of unease, the same sense of unseen hands moving fate's threads just beyond reach. The decisive battle came at dawn near a narrow river crossing. Mist blanketed the valley, and the enemy banners emerged like phantoms. The king's forces were outnumbered 2-1. Some urged retreat, but the king refused. "If we yield now," he said, "we teach the realm that fear rules us." His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. The Viking stepped forward, his hand on his axe. "Then let fear learn our names," he said quietly. A faint smile touched the king's lips, the smile of a man who knew he might die, but would not bend. The clash was brutal. Steel met steel, horses screamed, men fell into the river, their cries swallowed by the current. The Viking moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his axe cutting arcs of red mist. He fought not for plunder, but for something he could not name, perhaps for the man beside him, perhaps for the promise they had both made under a weary sun months ago. When the king was struck from his horse, the Viking was the first to reach him, dragging him to safety behind the shattered line. Blood seeped through the king's armor, and his breath came in shallow bursts. "Stay with me," the Viking said, though he knew the wound was mortal. The king's eyes met his, clear and calm even in pain. "Every man leaves something unfinished," he whispered. "Make sure mine isn't forgotten." By nightfall, the rebellion was crushed. The enemy fled into the woods, and the survivors lit no fires. The air was heavy with the stench of iron and smoke. The Viking knelt beside the fallen king, the torches casting long shadows across the valley. Around him, the soldiers stood in silence, waiting for a command that would never come. The Viking's face was streaked with blood and ash, but his eyes were hollow. In the distance, church bells began to toll, soft, mournful, echoing across the fields like a final benediction. He lifted the king's sword and drove it point first into the earth beside him, a silent vow that his promise would be kept. The funeral was held 3 days later in the ruined church that had once marked the border between kingdoms. Rain fell without pause, drumming on shields and cloaks. The priests spoke their rites, but their words felt small against the enormity of the loss. The Viking stood apart, bareheaded, his hands resting on the hilt of his axe. He did not kneel or pray. Instead, he watched the smoke rise from the pyre and thought of how the old gods would have honored a man like this, not with mourning, but with a feast in Valhalla. Yet even that thought brought him no comfort. The king's death had not been glorious, only necessary. And in that necessity lay the cruelty of all men's fates. When the flames died, the realm changed. The nobles who had once feared the foreign warrior now looked upon him with suspicion and envy. Whispers grew that he had brought death upon the king, that the pagan curse had claimed the throne. The Viking tried to ignore them at first, focusing on rebuilding the defenses, honoring his vow. But the court grew cold. The priests spoke his name in sermons as a warning, and the people began to spit when he passed. His loyalty, once praised, had become his burden. And though he had fought beside the king, he could not fight the slow erasure of memory that followed. One night, he returned to the river where the king had fallen. The battlefield was silent now, reclaimed by mist and grass. He knelt by the water's edge and placed a carved token into the current, the last piece of his homeland he carried. "You gave me a name," he whispered, "and now they will take it from me." The river carried the token away, and in its reflection, he saw himself fade, not as a man, but as a shadow bound to another's story. He left the kingdom soon after, walking north through endless rain. Some say he vanished into the sea, others that he was hunted and buried in an unmarked grave. But the truth, as always, was quieter. He became what the king had warned him of, a ghost built by endurance. His deeds, his loyalty, his very name would be rewritten, softened, erased. Yet somewhere, beneath the stones and silence, the echo of his oath remained. And when the wind passed over the fields where the king had once ruled, it carried with it a faint whisper in the old tongue, not of rage or vengeance, but remembrance. Years passed, and the world changed as if the land itself wished to forget the man it once feared and followed. The kingdom grew quiet under new rulers, but peace, like mist, was thin and temporary. The Vikings' name faded from songs first, then from records, then from the lips of those who once owed him their lives. History, it seemed, preferred simpler stories, those where kings die nobly and ghosts are left behind unnamed. Yet somewhere in the north, far from courts and crosses, the Viking still wandered. His hair was silver now, his hands scarred and heavy with time. He had no banner, no brothers, only a small boat and the endless horizon of gray water that had always called to him. He lived by the rhythm of the sea once more. Each morning, he rose to the cry of gulls and the sound of waves gnawing at the rocks. He fished when he could, traded in small ports when the weather allowed, but mostly he kept to the edges of the world, where stories seldom reached and memory faded slowly. At night, he would build a small fire and stare into the flames, seeing faces in the smoke, the king, the men he'd fought beside, the woman who had once tied a thread of red around his wrist before he left home. He had kept that thread all these years, worn and frayed, a ghost of a promise that even time could not erase. Sometimes, travelers passed through, monks seeking solitude, sailors escaping debts, wanderers like him. They spoke of the growing power of the church, of kings anointed with oil rather than crowned with blood, of peace declared in the name of one God over all others. The Viking would listen quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He had seen too much to believe in permanence. Peace, he would say softly, is only the breath between wars. The monks crossed themselves and moved on, murmuring prayers for his soul. He watched them vanish into the fog, knowing that their faith, though strong, would one day crack beneath the same weight that crushed all empires, time. In the deep of one winter, when snow swallowed the coastlines and ice clung to the oars, he fell ill. The fever came slowly, like a tide creeping inward, robbing him of strength day by day. He did not fight it. Instead, he wrapped himself in furs and lay by the shore, watching the gray sky darken. He spoke little, though sometimes, when the wind howled through the cliffs, he whispered to the sea as if to an old friend. "I kept my word," he said once, barely audible above the waves. He was not forgotten, not by me. In his fevered dreams, the king appeared again, younger, whole, standing in a field of sunlight. The vision did not speak, only looked at him with that same calm gaze that had once seen through him. It was not judgment, nor mercy, only remembrance. One morning, a fisherman found him lying by the water, his breath faint but steady, his eyes open to the horizon. The man tried to lift him, to carry him inland, but the Viking refused. "Leave me here," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I came from the sea. I will go to it." The fisherman hesitated, then nodded, sensing that this was no ordinary man but a fragment of an older world passing quietly into myth. By nightfall, the Viking's body had grown still. The tide rose and washed over him, pulling him gently into the dark. In the morning, only his cloak remained, pinned to a rock by the red thread still tied around his wrist. Word of the stranger's death spread slowly along the coast. Some said he was a sailor lost from the northern fleets, others whispered that he had once served a forgotten king. A monk, hearing these tales, recorded them in the margins of a prayer book, calling him the nameless one who kept his vow. That small note, scribbled in fading ink, became the only surviving trace of a man who had changed the course of a kingdom, yet whose name no one remembered. Centuries later, when the ruins of the old fort were excavated, they found a sword buried upright in the earth near the river where the great battle had been fought. No inscription, no emblem, just steel, preserved by soil and silence. The scholars argued about its origin, but none could prove who had wielded it. Some said it belonged to the king, others to his ghost. But legends are strange things. They grow in the dark, feeding on what history forgets. And in the north, among the fishermen and old storytellers, a tale began to stir again, of a warrior who had come from across the sea, who had fought for a king not his own, and whose soul still walked the borders between the living and the dead. They said that on certain nights, when the fog was thick and the waves struck the cliffs just so, a figure could be seen standing upon the shore, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs. He did not move or speak. He simply watched the horizon, as though waiting for a voice carried by the wind. Some believed he guarded something, the king's grave, perhaps, or the promise they had forged together. Others thought he sought forgiveness for the things he had done, though those who truly listened to the old songs knew better. He was not a ghost bound by guilt, but by memory. His was a loyalty that even death could not sever, a bond too strong for men or gods to erase. The sea had taken his body, but the story, quiet, half-forgotten, endured like the pulse beneath the earth. And in that endurance lay the final echo of his name. In time, the monks who recorded the tale called him by another name, not his true one, for that had vanished, but a name that meant the king's shadow. It appeared once in a manuscript of legends, written in Latin, then disappeared again. But in the dim corners of old abbeys and the whispers of sailors by firelight, his presence lingered. He had become what the king once warned him of, a ghost born not of death, but of endurance. And so, when storms broke upon the northern coasts and lightning illuminated the cliffs, some swore they could still see him, the ghost of the forgotten warrior, standing watch as he always had. The sea roared below, and the wind carried the faintest sound, a word no one could quite catch, though every heart knew what it meant. It was not sorrow. It was not rage. It was remembrance, the last gift of a man whose name the world erased, but whose story refused to die. Centuries passed, and the world reshaped itself, layer upon layer of time burying the memory of men who had once bled for crowns. Kingdoms rose and fell, their banners rotting into dust, their songs replaced by new ones that no longer carried the scent of sea or smoke. The Viking's name was gone now, erased even from the echo of rumor. But history has a strange way of remembering what it tries to forget. In the quiet corners of monasteries, in the fading margins of forgotten texts, faint traces of the story lingered, fragments of ink, half-told legends, the whisper of a ghost whose loyalty defied oblivion. It began with a monk in the 12th century, copying an old chronicle from the reign of a king whose name had nearly vanished from English record. Between the careful lines of Latin, he found an unusual passage written in an older, coarser hand. It spoke of a northern warrior, unnamed, but described with such reverence that it struck him as more than mere myth. The passage ended abruptly. He kept the oath when all others broke. He guarded the king's soul, and in doing so, became lost to his own name. The monk hesitated before erasing the line, as his abbot had instructed. Instead, he traced over it lightly, preserving the ghost beneath new ink, an act of quiet rebellion that ensured the Viking's shadow would survive a little longer. Generations later, a scholar rediscovered the same manuscript, though the ink had faded to near invisibility. He was drawn to that faint phrase and spent years seeking its meaning. He found scattered references, a ballad in an obscure dialect, a weathered carving near the old northern coast, and a rusted sword unearthed by peasants who swore the ground beneath it hummed during storms. Piece by piece, he reconstructed the myth of the king's shadow. He wrote of a man who had crossed the sea to fight for a foreign ruler, a warrior who had stood at the border between two faiths and vanished after his king's death. The scholar's peers dismissed it as romantic fancy, yet his writings spread quietly through the universities and taverns alike. The story, once erased, began to breathe again. By the 1600s, it had transformed into legend. The poets called him the Silent Sentinel, sailors called him the Watcher of the Mist. In some versions, he was cursed never to rest until the kingdom was whole again. In others, he guarded a treasure buried beneath the river where his king had fallen, not gold, but a relic of divine power. Yet through every telling one thread remained, his loyalty. That single, unbroken vow was what kept him alive in the memory of men who no longer remembered his name. And perhaps that was the greater victory, not the wars he fought, but the endurance of his promise. In the 19th century, when historians began to dig beneath ruined abbeys and old battlefields, they found traces of a reality far stranger than fiction. In a monastery cellar in Wessex, an archivist uncovered a burial stone unlike the others, older, unmarked except for a faint rune, almost erased by centuries of moisture. It was a symbol not of Christian faith but of the North, the shape of protection, of oath. Nearby lay fragments of a blade, blackened by age but still sharp to the touch. No inscription, no royal crest. Just steel and silence. The find was dismissed by the church, sealed away in storage, but a few who saw it whispered that the legend of the Viking ghost might not be legend at all. As decades turned to centuries, storytellers reinvented the tale. Painters captured the image of a lone warrior on a gray shore, his face half hidden by shadow. Poets wrote of eternal watchers, of men bound not by chains but by vows that reached beyond death. Each retelling shifted the meaning. Sometimes he was a warning, sometimes a protector, sometimes both. Yet the emotion remained the same, a melancholy reverence for something ancient, loyal, and human. Listeners often said the story carried a strange peace, as though it spoke to the part of every heart that fears being forgotten. In the modern age, his ghost found a new home. In books, in films, in the quiet fascination of those who study myth. Archaeologists traced the battlefields, searching for proof, but all they found were echoes. A sword buried upright, a token of red thread in a coastal grave, a name scratched faintly into an oak beam in a long-collapsed chapel. He who endures. Historians debated its authenticity, but for those who believed, no proof was needed. The Viking had become something greater than a man. He was the embodiment of memory itself, of what happens when devotion refuses to die, even when the world moves on. Some nights, along the northern coast where the sea gnaws endlessly at the stones, locals still tell his story. They speak of the storms that come without warning, how the waves rise higher than any man remembers, and how, in the flash of lightning, a figure appears on the cliffs. Not malevolent, not seeking revenge, but simply watching. Those who have seen it say he holds something in his hand, not a weapon, but a fragment of cloth, perhaps once red. He does not move. He only stands there as the sea crashes below, as if ensuring that what was once sworn is never broken. And when the storm fades, the air carries with it a strange stillness, like the echo of a voice long ago silenced. In truth, no one can say whether he was real or myth. Perhaps he was only a soldier, forgotten by time. Perhaps his loyalty, magnified by centuries of retelling, became too large for history to contain. But even now, when scholars speak of that lost age, they always return to one question. Why would a man give everything, even his name, for a king not his own? Some say it was love. Others say it was honor. But the story itself, unbroken and unburied, offers the quietest answer of all. Because some promises, once made, do not belong to men anymore. They belong to eternity. And so, his ghost remains, not as a curse, but as a kind of grace. He is the reminder that devotion, though buried, can outlast empires. That silence can carry a voice louder than any song. And that somewhere, beyond the reach of history, a nameless Viking still keeps his watch, not seeking glory or redemption, but ensuring that what was once loved, once sworn, once true, is never truly forgotten. The sea has always been a mirror for memory, restless, infinite, and faithful only to its own tides. Centuries after the last trace of his name had faded, the same waters that once carried his ship still whispered of him. The waves crashed upon the northern cliffs with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as though repeating a story that the world had chosen to forget. Those who lived along the coast sometimes felt it, an unease that settled in the air during long nights, when the fog rolled in thick and low. Fishermen spoke of hearing footsteps along the rocks, slow and heavy, like those of a man burdened by time. They said he appeared when the world was quietest, when the moon hung low and the sea turned to silver. A shadow among waves. A ghost who had not learned how to stop keeping watch. One autumn evening, a traveler arrived in one of those coastal villages, a historian from the city, young but with the eyes of someone who had read too much of the past. He came seeking a name he had found buried in a manuscript, a nameless warrior, described as the king's shadow. The villagers laughed at first, dismissing his interest as the curiosity of a man who believed that stories could outlive truth. But one old woman, her face weathered as driftwood, beckoned him closer. She told him that what he sought still lingered nearby, not in the ruins or the records, but in the places where the sea met the land. "You can't write his name," she said, her voice like wind through reeds. "Because he never spoke it again. The sea took it back." Intrigued, the historian followed the coastline for days, tracing the cliffs and caves where the wind howled like distant voices. He carried a notebook filled with sketches and fragments of song, piecing together what remained of the legend. In the evenings, he sat by the fire in small inns, asking sailors about the old stories. Most shrugged or changed the subject, but some whispered that they had seen the figure, tall, cloaked, standing where the surf met the stones. "Not a ghost," one fisherman said, something older. "Like the sea remembering itself." The historian wrote it all down, feeling the strange weight of awe and sorrow intertwine. He had come to study history, but now it felt as though history were studying him. One night, as the storm rolled in from the north, he reached the headland where the river met the sea, the place where, according to a single faded text, a great battle had once been fought. Lightning tore the sky apart, illuminating the ruins of an old watchtower. The historian climbed the slope, his lantern flickering wildly in the wind. He found no graves, no relics, only a single stone carved with faint runes almost erased by centuries of rain. He knelt beside it, tracing the grooves with trembling fingers. It was a sigil of endurance, the same mark the Norse had used to bless warriors before battle. At that moment, the wind died, and for a breath, the storm went silent. In that silence, he thought he heard a voice. Not loud, not clear, more like the sound of something remembered by the earth itself. Words he could not translate, yet whose meaning he somehow understood. "I kept my oath." He turned, his lantern casting its final glow across the cliffs, and there, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. Broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs, face hidden by shadow. The historian froze, unable to speak. The figure did not move. The sea roared behind him, and then, as the next flash of lightning tore across the sky, the figure was gone. Only the sound of the tide remained, and the faint scent of salt and smoke in the air. When he returned to the village at dawn, drenched and pale, he said nothing of what he had seen. But in his journal he wrote a single line beneath the date: "He endures." That night, he left the village without a word, leaving behind his notebook on the inn's wooden table. Years later, it would be found by another traveler, its pages damp and stained with sea spray. The final entry, half blurred by water, read, "Some names do not need to be remembered, they are carried by the wind." Time moved on as it always does. The cliffs eroded, the sea devoured what the land refused to keep, and the modern world crept closer with its lights and noise. The legends became tourist tales, stories told for coin, stripped of their ache and reverence. But the locals still felt something in the air. When storms swept in from the north, they barred their doors and left a candle in the window, not out of fear, but out of respect. For they knew that somewhere beyond the visible world, the king's ghost and his nameless guardian still stood side by side, their bond unbroken by centuries. And yet, in the quiet that follows every storm, when the clouds part and the moon returns, the truth of it all becomes strangely clear. The Viking's ghost is not a haunting. It is a memory made flesh, the embodiment of a promise too heavy to die. His endurance is not punishment, but purpose. He is the part of history that refuses to yield to the forgetting, a living echo of loyalty, loss, and devotion that transcends time. The sea, the wind, the rain, all of it carries fragments of him. You cannot find him in books or graves. You can only feel him, like the hush that follows prayer. Perhaps that is why his story still stirs something in those who hear it, that quiet ache of recognition. Because in his endurance, there is something profoundly human, the desire to be remembered not for glory, but for meaning. To stand for something so deeply that even when the world moves on, it still leaves a shape where you once stood. The Viking became a ghost not because he was cursed, but because he kept faith with something greater than himself. He became the proof that memory, when born of love and loyalty, can outlive flesh, time, even language. And so, when the sea calls and the waves rise against the cliffs, it is said that he returns, not as a phantom seeking rest, but as a keeper of promises. Watching, waiting, unseen. A reminder carved into the breath of the earth itself, that no act of devotion is ever truly lost, and no name is ever fully erased while its story still lives. His silence speaks across the centuries, not of sorrow, but of stillness. Not of ending, but of endurance. Centuries later, the age of kings and warriors had long passed into the dust of museums and archives. Yet history, like the sea, never truly settles. In northern Scandinavia, where the fjords cut deep into the land and the mists cling to the earth like old breath, a team of archaeologists set camp near the remnants of a forgotten burial mound. The air was sharp, the soil heavy with rain, and the cries of distant gulls echoed faintly against the cliffs. They came seeking fragments of the Viking era, weapons, carvings, perhaps a shard of bone or bronze that could illuminate another page of the past. What they found, however, would unsettle the boundary between myth and memory. The excavation began with quiet reverence. The dig site was small, marked by ancient stones barely visible beneath moss. Yet the deeper they dug, the more deliberate the ground seemed, not the random collapse of time, but the careful concealment of something sacred. Beneath layers of wet soil, they discovered the faint outline of a ship, its timber long rotted away but its form unmistakable. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Ingrid Savik, paused when her trowel struck something firm. It was not metal, not bone, but a smooth slab of darkened rock etched with faint runes. She brushed it clean with trembling fingers, and under the dim northern sun, a single name emerged, or what should have been a name. The runes were carved with precision, yet one section was violently scratched out, gouged so deeply that no translation could restore it. That night, the team sat around the fire, their faces flickering in the orange glow. They discussed possibilities, rival clans, lost kings, curses. But Ingrid felt a quiet pull, a sensation that the silence of the site held more meaning than the words carved into it. She returned alone to the mound, the wind whispering over the grass. When she stood beside the open earth, she heard it, the low hum of the sea in the distance, a rhythm too steady, too deliberate. And for the first time, she felt as though she wasn't discovering history, she was trespassing upon it. Ingrid's notes from that week would later puzzle her colleagues. She wrote of strange things, of flickering lights near the shore, of dreams in which she stood on a ship made of shadow, sailing through a fog that whispered in old tongues. She dreamt of a man with no face, holding a torch beside a throne of stone, his voice echoing like thunder muffled by water. He never spoke words she could understand, but each time she woke, her heart pounded with the echo of his presence. She would rise from her cot, step outside into the frozen night, and find the northern lights dancing above her like a silent song. The colors reflected off the water below, as if the sky itself was remembering. On the fifth night, a storm descended without warning. Winds tore at the tents, rain lashed the earth, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs roared like drums of war. Ingrid and her team took shelter, but one of the assistants swore he saw a figure standing beyond the floodlights, tall, cloaked, unmoving. When morning came, the air was eerily still. Half the excavation site had collapsed under the rain, and the slab bearing the erased name had split down the center. The crack ran perfectly through the ruined runes, dividing them into mirrored halves, like two worlds split by silence. Ingrid took the pieces to a nearby research lab, determined to decipher them. Using infrared imaging, she discovered faint traces beneath the scratched surface, symbols of the Vegvisor, an ancient Norse compass meant to guide travelers through storms, both physical and spiritual. Beneath it, another phrase emerged in fractured script: "He guards the oath." The team debated its meaning, but Ingrid could not shake the feeling that the slab had not merely been carved, it had been sealed. A boundary, not a message. A memory, not a monument. Weeks passed. The research moved slowly, and funding began to wane. Yet Ingrid could not leave. Each night, she wandered the shore, feeling the pulse of the tide beneath her feet. The sea had a sound, not just of waves, but of rhythm, almost like breath. Sometimes, she thought she heard voices carried in the wind, not distinct, but layered like echoes of prayer. On the final evening before she was ordered to abandon the site, she stood before the mound one last time. The twilight stretched long and silver, the kind of light that makes time feel fragile. And there, at the edge of the world, she whispered, "Who are you?" The wind shifted. The sea stilled. And out of the mist, faint as smoke, she saw it, the outline of a ship gliding silently across the horizon. Its sail was torn, its figurehead fractured, but its form was unmistakable. A ghostly vessel, drifting without sound, its path illuminated only by the dying sun. On its deck stood a single figure, cloaked, unmoving. Ingrid felt tears gather in her eyes, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of recognition, as though the earth itself was remembering her question. The ship faded into the mist, leaving behind only the soft hiss of waves breaking against the shore. When she returned to the city, she presented her findings to the historical council. The slab, the runes, the erased name. But what she could not explain was what she had felt, the weight of presence, the sensation that something in the past had looked back. Her report ended with a single line: "Some stories are not meant to be found, they find you." She never returned to that site again. Yet sometimes, years later, when she lectured about Viking burial traditions, her voice would catch when she spoke of the nameless warrior, the erased king, and the silence that binds them. Because in her dreams, she still heard the tide whispering his name, not in words, but in rhythm. The story of that excavation spread quietly among scholars and local fishermen alike. Some dismissed it as myth, others as spiritual imagination. But on stormy nights, the villagers say they still see a pale light moving over the water, gliding slowly before vanishing into fog. And when asked what it is, they answer softly, almost reverently, "It's the king's ghost returning to sea, and the one who guards him still." In that quiet legend lies the truth of all forgotten history, that the past does not die, it waits. It breathes beneath the soil, it hums beneath the tide, it flickers in the minds of those who listen. And for those who dare to look too closely, it will always reveal something more than fact, something human, something eternal. The Viking who became a ghost is not a warning, he is a mirror, a reflection of all we fear to forget, and all we are destined to remember. Long after the archaeologists had packed away their tools and the storms had quieted, the land itself seemed to hold a strange, unspoken tension, a hum beneath the stillness. The mound stood again untouched, grass reclaiming its edges, the earth sealing its secrets as it always had. But legends have a way of surviving the silence. Word of the ghost ship and the vanished runes spread far beyond the northern coast, whispered first among fishermen, then through online forums, podcasts, and documentaries hungry for mystery. Yet none of them could capture what lingered there, the weight of absence, the sense that history itself was watching. Among those drawn to the story was a writer named Erik Halvorsen, known for his books on Norse mythology and lost Scandinavian folklore. He arrived years later, alone, driven by a fascination he couldn't quite explain. The local innkeeper recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted curiosity the archaeologist had carried before him. Erik brought with him maps, journals, and recordings, determined to separate truth from legend. But when he reached the site, what he found was not evidence, but atmosphere, a silence so deep it seemed alive. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and salt, and the horizon stretched in gray stillness. He stood there for a long time, notebook in hand, listening to nothing and everything. In his first nights by the shore, he wrote about the unease of the landscape, how the wind carried the rhythm of breath, how the waves seemed to follow a pattern like the echo of oars. He described it as a presence that does not need to be seen to be believed. Each day, he explored further, the cliffs, the meadows, the half-buried stones that hinted at old foundations. But what unsettled him most was the way his dreams began to shift. He started hearing voices in his sleep, not clear words, but murmurs, layered and ancient, like a choir beneath water. Sometimes, he dreamt of walking along the shore beside a tall figure, cloaked in furs, whose face he could never see. And each morning when he woke, his boots were damp with sea spray, though he swore he'd never left his room. He continued his research during the day, finding fragments in church records and forgotten sagas that hinted at a nameless warrior who had kept the king's oath beyond the grave. The records were inconsistent. Some called him a guardian, others a revenant. One described him as the hand that never fell, the voice that never spoke. Eric began to realize that the story had not vanished. It had been deliberately veiled. Someone in history had wanted this man forgotten, not out of hatred, but out of reverence, as if his duty had extended even into silence. The more he read, the more he felt an invisible hand guiding him, leading him toward something neither history nor faith could explain. One night, unable to sleep, Eric took his lantern and walked down to the shore. The sea was unnaturally calm, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The moon hung low, silvering the waves. As he walked along the dark sand, he noticed the faint outline of footprints leading toward the water, large, distinct, but ending abruptly where the tide began. He followed them until the cold waves touched his boots. The air trembled, heavy with unseen life. Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the horizon, he saw it, a single flicker of light, like a torch held high in the fog. He froze, heart pounding. The light swayed once, twice, then vanished. When he returned to the inn, he said nothing, but his notebook filled with strange, poetic fragments. "The sea remembers," he wrote. "It keeps what time cannot bear." The next day, he recorded an audio diary, his voice steady but low. "There's something here that is neither legend nor fact. Something that breathes through both. The ghost of the king's shadow is not bound to one form or name. He is the echo of an oath, and he endures because we still tell his story." That night, as he recorded, the microphone captured a faint second voice. Not human, not mechanical, just a whisper, repeating his words. Weeks later, Eric vanished. His belongings were found neatly packed in his room, his journals sealed in a waterproof case, and his recorder left running on the desk. The final entry was brief. "He was never gone," Eric said softly, as though speaking to someone in the room. "He simply waits until we remember him." Then there was a long silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves. When rescuers searched the coastline, they found no trace of him, only a set of footprints leading toward the sea, ending at the edge of the tide. The villagers shook their heads, not in disbelief, but in recognition. "The sea takes who listens too closely," one said. And yet, for months afterward, strange things began to happen along the coast. Radios crackled with static that shaped itself into patterns like whispered runes. Fishermen reported hearing music beneath the waves, faint and sorrowful. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick and low, a single light could be seen drifting across the water, slow and steady, like a watch kept through eternity. Scholars debated Eric's fate. Some claimed he had staged his disappearance for fame, others that he had fallen victim to the treacherous currents. But those who had read his notes, the ones he sent before his last night, felt differently. His words carried a tone not of fear, but of understanding. He wrote, "Perhaps history does not belong to those who record it, but to those who live within its echoes. The forgotten are never truly lost, only waiting for the right voice to remember." Over time, his journals became part of a small collection at a regional museum. Visitors often remarked that his handwriting seemed to change near the end, growing bolder, older, as though someone else had taken the pen. One curator swore that every time she turned to the final page, she felt a faint breeze brush across her hands, cold, salt-scented, like air from the sea. Whether it was imagination or something beyond, no one could say. And so the legend deepened. The Viking who became the king's ghost, the archaeologist who unearthed his memory, the writer who vanished into the waves, their stories wove into one, a tapestry of loyalty, memory, and the haunting persistence of devotion. The name erased from stone became immortal in silence, its truth carried not in words, but in the quiet pulse of the tide. And still, in that desolate stretch of coast where history meets eternity, the wind whispers the same refrain to those who linger too long. Some oaths are not broken by death. They are kept until the end of time. The sea, it seems, never forgets. Decades passed since Eric's disappearance, yet the story only deepened its roots, twisting between folklore and fact, blurring the line between remembrance and haunting. Tourists came now and then, drawn by curiosity or the eerie beauty of the coastline, but they never stayed long. There was a feeling there, a weight in the air that defied description. Locals said it was not fear, but reverence. When the fog rolled in from the north and the gulls went silent, they claimed you could feel a heartbeat beneath the wind. Some said it belonged to the earth, others to the sea. But the elders knew better. They said it was the echo of an oath still being kept. One winter, when the sea froze along the shore and the nights stretched endless and pale, a small film crew arrived to document the legend. Their producer, a pragmatic man from Oslo, laughed at the superstition but saw profit in the mystery. He wanted the story for television, a glossy retelling for audiences craving Nordic ghosts. The team brought cameras, drones, sound equipment, and enough lights to drown the stars. But even on the first night, something felt off. The equipment glitched without reason. The air microphones captured faint low hums that no one could trace. The locals warned them not to film after midnight, but deadlines and disbelief are powerful things. The director, a woman named Freya Lind, had grown up hearing these tales as a child, though she dismissed them as myths. But on the third night, as the fog rolled thick across the sea, she began to feel a strange pull, not of danger, but of presence. The sound crew was setting up near the edge of the cliff when she saw it, a faint light flickering far out on the water, moving against the wind. She called the cameraman to capture it, but by the time the lens focused, the light was gone. The tide grew restless, waves striking the rocks harder than before. Freya lowered her headset, listening. Between gusts of wind, she swore she heard something that sounded like a voice, low, rhythmic, almost chanting. Later, when they reviewed the footage in the cabin, the room fell silent. The drone's camera, though unfocused, had caught a shape on the horizon, a dark silhouette rising and vanishing with the waves. It was impossible to tell what it was. A ship, a shadow, or something else entirely. The audio file beneath it contained no wind, no sea, only a single, sustained hum, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sound technician frowned and rewound it again and again. "It's not mechanical," he whispered. "It's patterned." The following day, a storm hit without warning, cutting power across the entire region. The team huddled inside the cabin, listening to the wind howl like a living thing. Sometime past midnight, the lights flickered back on, only for the monitors to awaken on their own, playing footage they had not recorded. It showed the shoreline under moonlight, waves shimmering silver, and faint footsteps pressed into the wet sand, moving slowly, purposefully, toward the water. Then a single line appeared across the screen, written in Old Norse script. "He keeps watch still." The generator sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. The crew was shaken but unharmed. Yet Freya noticed something peculiar. The shoreline had changed. The mound they'd filmed the day before had partially collapsed, revealing a fragment of stone etched with the same erased runes the archaeologist had once found. She knelt beside it, brushing away the frost, and felt a sudden warmth against her palm, as though the stone itself were alive. The cameraman urged her to leave it, but she couldn't. Beneath the frost, beneath the scarred lines, a single rune remained untouched, a symbol meaning endurance. She whispered it aloud, and in that moment, a gust of wind rose from the sea, swirling around her like breath. That night she dreamed. She stood on a vast dark ocean, the sky fractured with lightning, and before her loomed the ghostly ship, its torn sail illuminated by a pale, spectral glow. On its deck stood two figures, one tall and broad, the other regal, cloaked in shadow. She felt no fear, only awe. The taller one stepped forward, raising an unseen blade in silent salute. The other, the king she somehow knew, placed a hand on his shoulder. No words passed between them, yet the meaning was clear. The oath endures. When she woke, her hands were trembling, and the sound of waves echoed faintly in her ears, though the sea lay miles away. The documentary was never completed. Most of the footage was corrupted, the sound files erased, the visuals warped beyond recovery. The network executives dismissed it as technical failure, but those who had been there knew better. Freya left filmmaking soon after, retreating to a quiet life inland. She never spoke publicly about what happened, though she kept one frame from the corrupted footage, a single still image showing the faint outline of a longship cresting the mist. Over the years, she would sometimes sit before it at night, staring into its ghostly form, feeling both peace and sorrow. Some years later, a young student researching Norse maritime traditions came across Freya's abandoned notes in an archive. Among them was a short passage, written in her unmistakable hand: "The sea does not haunt. It remembers. And sometimes, it asks to be remembered in return." He included her quote in his dissertation, unaware of the full story, and in doing so, carried the legend further still. Because stories like these never truly die, they change form, they drift through time, carried on the breath of those who still whisper them. In the coastal villages, where the legend began, candles still burn on windowsills during the winter storms. The elders say it's not to ward off spirits, but to guide them home, a light for the guardian who still walks between this world and the next. Children grow up hearing of the nameless Viking who kept his oath to a forgotten king, of the scholar who heard his voice, of the filmmaker who saw his ship, and they learn something unspoken, that loyalty can outlast memory, and love can outlive time. And so, beneath the endless rhythm of waves, the legend breathes on. Not as a ghost story, but as a kind of prayer, soft, persistent, ancient. The sea hums the same tune it always has, and if you listen closely on nights when the wind turns cold and the moonlight drapes the water in silver, you might hear it too, the faint beat of an oath that refuses to fade. For the Viking who became a king's ghost was never seeking rest. He was keeping his promise, and perhaps, in the quiet of the world's forgotten corners, he still is. There comes a point in every story where history and memory blur, where the edges of fact dissolve into the gentle mist of legend. The tale of the nameless Viking and the ghost of his king has reached that point. It no longer belongs to the past, it lives somewhere quieter, somewhere in between. The old coast remains unchanged, the cliffs dark and weathered, the sea restless as ever. Yet those who walk its edge feel it still, the faint rhythm beneath their feet, the quiet pulse of something ancient enduring in the heart of the wind. It is not fear they feel, but presence, an understanding too deep for language. In modern times, the world has learned to doubt what cannot be measured. Yet there are places where the veil between the known and the forgotten is still thin, and this coast is one of them. Each winter, scholars, wanderers, and storytellers come seeking proof, to see the ship, to record the hum, to find the erased name. None ever succeed, but all leave changed. They speak of strange dreams that feel older than themselves, of whispers in a tongue no one remembers but everyone somehow understands. They speak of walking along the water's edge and feeling watched, not by something menacing, but by something vast, patient, and sorrowful. Among these visitors was a linguist named Alva, who came not to find ghosts, but to study the rune fragments recovered years before. She was a skeptic, guided by evidence, yet she found herself drawn to the story's quiet gravity. The more she studied the symbols, the more they began to shift in her perception. The scratched-out names seemed almost deliberate, not erasure, but protection. The remaining rune, the one meaning endurance, pulsed in her mind with a strange familiarity, as though it belonged not to history, but to the present moment. She began to translate fragments from old Norse texts that had long been dismissed as incomplete. What she uncovered was not a tale of revenge or haunting, but of guardianship, of a man who had promised his king not loyalty in life, but remembrance beyond death. As she pieced the fragments together, a pattern emerged, the description of a ship buried not to rest, but to wait. Its crew silent, its sail tattered, its helm turned toward eternity. The final line of one forgotten saga read, "When the sea remembers, so shall he rise." Alva found herself reading that line over and over, as if trying to grasp the heartbeat behind the words. The more she read, the more her dreams began to shift. She dreamt of walking through endless mist, of hearing waves crash like distant drums, of a man standing alone on a cliff, watching over a ghostly fleet. When she awoke, she could never recall his face, only the feeling that he was still keeping watch. On her final night at the coast, Alva sat by the water, her research complete, her questions unanswered. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of salt and snow. The sea shimmered under the moon, a vast mirror of silver light. She whispered into the wind, not a question, but a simple thank you. For a moment, everything went still. Then, far beyond the breakers, a light flickered once, faint but unmistakable. It moved across the horizon slowly, steadily, as if answering her. She smiled, not in fear, but in understanding. Some stories, she realized, do not need endings. They exist only to be witnessed. Years later, her writings would become part of an anthology on Norse mythology. But tucked between her academic notes were small handwritten passages, reflections that read more like prayers than research. There is a difference, she wrote, between being forgotten and being at peace. He was never lost. He simply became the silence between waves. Another passage read, "We speak of ghosts as if they are gone. But perhaps they are simply those who remember when the world forgets." Her words, though personal, captured what no textbook ever could, that history is not just what survives in books and stones, but what lingers in the spaces between them. And so, through every retelling, the legend finds new life. Each voice that speaks his story, from the old fisherman on the coast to the scholar in her study, adds another ripple to the endless sea of memory. The nameless Viking, the erased king, the oath that defied time, they all become part of something larger than myth. They become a reminder that devotion, once given freely, never truly dies. It changes form, finding new ways to endure. Perhaps that is why the sea hums at night, why the wind carries words we can't quite hear. The story doesn't end because it was never about ending. It was about keeping watch, and the quiet dignity of remembrance. When the storms come, the villagers still light their candles. They say the flame is not for protection, but gratitude, for the guardian who stands unseen in the mist. Children grow up knowing his name cannot be spoken, yet they know his story by heart. In the hush before dawn, when the world feels fragile and infinite, they swear they can hear him walking along the cliffs, slow, steady, eternal. The king's ghost, they say, is no longer alone. He is one with the sea, with the wind, with every voice that dares to remember. Perhaps that is the truest form of immortality, not to live forever, but to be carried forward through the hearts of those who listen. And so his tale drifts onward, as soft and enduring as the tide, retold by voices who do not even know his name. Because somewhere, in the quiet space between memory and myth, the oath still stands unbroken. The king is at rest. The guardian endures. And the sea, the great keeper of all forgotten things, continues to whisper their story again and again until the end of time. The sea remembers everything. Long after empires crumble and languages fade, it carries the memory of all that once was, whispers caught in waves, songs swallowed by storms, promises buried beneath the silt. And somewhere within that endless rhythm, the Viking story remains, quiet but unbroken. Those who listen carefully enough, sailors drifting half asleep, historians chasing myths, or dreamers standing at the edge of the shore, sometimes hear it. A hum beneath the surface, a sound that is not sound, but memory. It begins faintly, like the breath of the tide, and if you close your eyes, it feels almost like a heartbeat. It is said that when the wind rises just before dawn, the sea glows faintly blue, not from the moon, not from reflection, but from something deeper. The locals call it the ghost light. Scientists explain it as bioluminescence, but the old fishermen shake their heads. They say it's the light from the king's ship, still sailing beneath the surface, still guided by the hand of the forgotten guardian. They say that once a century, the light grows stronger, drifting closer to shore, as if seeking something it lost. No one knows for sure what happens then, but the villagers never sleep that night. They sit by their windows with candles lit, listening to the low hum of the waves, waiting for the sea to speak. In one such village, there stands a wooden chapel so weathered it leans with the wind. Its beams are carved with runes no scholar can fully translate. Inside, at the altar, lies a stone that glows faintly when the tide is high. It bears no name, no inscription, only a single mark, the same rune for endurance that Alva once studied. Each year, people leave small offerings there, a coin, a feather, a piece of driftwood, a child's drawing of a ship. No one remembers exactly when the tradition began, only that it must never stop. Because if the offerings cease, the elders say, the sea will take back what it lent, memory itself. Travelers who come upon the chapel often describe the same strange feeling. The air inside hums gently, like the resonance of a deep note, too low to hear but impossible to ignore. Some claim to see shadows moving in the corners, as if the light bends differently within those walls. One scholar years ago wrote that the space felt alive with patience. Another wrote simply, "He waits." There are those who believe that when the sea glows and the waves strike the cliffs just right, the chapel trembles, not in fear, but in recognition. But this is not a story of fear. It is a story of connection, of how something lost becomes a bridge between worlds. The Viking who became a ghost, the king whose name was erased, the scholar who listened to silence, all of them are bound by the same thread, remembrance. The older villagers teach their children that remembrance is not just memory, it is an act of love. To remember is to keep something alive in the quietest way possible, without fanfare, without certainty, without proof. The children grow up whispering the story before sleep, imagining the ship sailing through moonlit fog, its crew of shadows still loyal, still keeping their oath. And sometimes, when the night is very still and the waves are gentle, the story feels close enough to touch. The moon reflects on the water in long, trembling lines, and the wind smells of iron and pine. Somewhere out there, in the horizon's haze, a faint shape moves, not solid, not quite light. Some say it's a trick of the eyes. Others say it's the ghost ship, still watching, still protecting the kingdom that no longer exists. But for those who believe, it's not about proof. It's about the feeling, that strange peace that comes when you realize the past is never truly gone. Perhaps that is the reason this story endures while so many others fade. It doesn't demand belief. It simply invites stillness. It allows you to listen, to the sea, to time, to the spaces between. The Viking's tale, like the tide, flows and recedes, carrying both sorrow and serenity. It reminds us that history isn't carved in stone. It's whispered in the dark, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, across centuries. Even erased names can echo. Even forgotten men can guard the living. And so, when the last light fades and the world falls into its gentlest silence, imagine standing there, at the edge of the coast, where the land ends and eternity begins. The air is cool, the sea breathes softly, and in that vast, unbroken rhythm, you can feel him. Not as a ghost but as something older, a promise kept. You realize that remembrance isn't about holding on to what was, but allowing it to live through you. You take a deep breath, and the sound of the sea feels like a heartbeat again, slow, endless, eternal. The story closes not with an ending, but a continuation, a return to the beginning. The sea remembers everything, and now, so do you. The guardian's watch goes on, the king's peace endures, and the hum beneath the waves carries their names in the language of forever. And so, the tide pulls back once more, carrying the last whisper of the story into the dark. The sea glimmers faintly, as if winking in quiet acknowledgement of what has been told. Somewhere beyond sight, a ship drifts beneath the moonlight, timeless, patient, whole. The waves speak, not in words but in memory, reminding all who listen that nothing truly disappears. The guardian remains, unseen yet eternal, keeping his silent vigil over the forgotten king. The world sleeps, the sea hums, and the story, soft as breath, continues its endless, peaceful circle.